All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Tim Butler. I'm a state representative from the 87th District. I live here in Springfield. I'm joined today by Representative Avery Bourne from the 95th District, who lives in Morrisonville. And we're here today to once again talk about the automatic voter registration. On December 13th, Secretary of State's office notified State Board of Elections that there was an issue with automatic voter registration in Illinois. January 20th, after it came out publicly that this letter had been sent, we called on myself and the members of the House Executive Committee. The Republican members called for a hearing, sent a letter to the Speaker. On January 22nd, we had a news conference in this very room talking about AVR, and I called on the State Board of Elections at that time to perform an independent audit of AVR. On January 29th, the State Board of Elections, with a vote along partisan lines, voted down a motion to perform a review of the automatic voter registration in Illinois. January 29th, the Secretary of State's office admitted they were sending 16-year-olds through the system to local election authorities. February 5th, we had an executive committee hearing, and at that time, we were assured by the Secretary of State that the problems were fixed. And Secretary White himself at that hearing said, "I've put my staff on notice. Zero tolerance will be the order of the day with the Secretary of State's office going forward." And I believe it was Chairman Welch who made the comment that heads will roll if problems persist after this. February 7th, the Secretary of State told the State Board and local election authorities that they will not be transmitting information on the weekends when it came to AVR. February 14th, I introduced House Bill 5224, which would suspend AVR and perform a review and make sure that we're doing it right so we can get it back up and going correctly. On February 24th, Congressman Davis, a member of the U.S. House Administration Committee, convened an AVR listening session here in Springfield where Secretary of State, State Board, and finally local election officials were heard from. Again, we were assured that things were corrected. On February 28th, advocacy groups filed a lawsuit against Secretary of State and the State Board of Elections for, quote, bungling the implementation of AVR. And then this week, what we have that just came to light this week is at least over 1,100 Illinois citizens were improperly registered as opt-out. So what we have here in Illinois, what we've seen over the last couple months, is that we've registered non-citizens to vote while we're denying actual citizens their voting rights that they have in the state of Illinois. And I'm not convinced that 1,100 number is accurate. When you talk to the Sangamon County clerk, he says there was over 100 that were relayed to him that were an issue, when the State Board of Elections said it was only 20 that was relayed to him. So I think there's probably more than that 1,100 across the state. And I would say the communications on this has been terrible from especially the Secretary of State's office and the State Board of Elections. They know, they've been on notice for a couple months now that this is a problem. And I don't believe the legislature received word one about this most recent problem after they've been before the legislature for a hearing and before a congressional listening session as well. AVR is a complete mess today. And I think for myself personally, we've been assured for over 2 months now that the problems have been fixed, yet problems continue to come up. I've lost complete confidence in the Secretary of State being able to carry out this program. It is a disaster as we're looking at it today. March 1 was the deadline for anyone who was registering under AVR to be forwarded and be eligible for the March 17th primary. Obviously, people can still register to vote, but it's my understanding March 1 was the cutoff. Any AVRs after that wouldn't be eligible for the March 17th primary. So we have time now that AVR is done for the before the primary election to take a hard look at AVR. Today, I filed House Resolution 827. It's an audit resolution that calls for the State Board of Elections to engage in an outside, independent audit, not the Auditor General. And I think this is important. The Auditor General has an ongoing case before the State Board of Elections. I think we need an outside, independent audit to be performed on the entire AVR system. And as some of you may know, an audit resolution only needs to be passed by one chamber. It doesn't need both chambers. It only needs one chamber to trigger the audit. Additionally, I asked that House Bill 5224, which is legislation that I introduced on Valentine's Day, which is the the suspension of AVR so we can review it. I asked that bill be released from the Rules Committee, and that we have the opportunity to have an up or down vote on whether or not we should suspend the AVR system in Illinois. And lastly, I call on the House Executive Committee. I know spokesperson Wheeler, who I talked to last night, had a conversation with Chairman Welch yesterday about this. But I would call on the Executive Committee to again have another hearing with Secretary White in attendance so we can hear directly again as to what the problems with AVR and how they're going to correct this latest issue and absolutely assure us that there will be no problems going forward. With that, I would turn it over to Representative Bourne.
Thank you. I'm Avery Bourne, State Representative for the 95th District. I joined Representative Murphy and Representative Butler at Congressman Davis's congressional listening session, as he mentioned. That was the first time that local election authorities had been able to weigh in on this issue in an official capacity. And there we heard some really important suggestions from the clerks, because they are the ones who are tasked with implementing this election that's less than 1 week away. This is now the fourth issue that we've seen with AVR alone. And we're hearing now that some of them may have to have 2 different poll books at each polling place, especially with clerks who are already having a difficult time with resources, with finding election judges for these polling places. Having this much more to deal with from the Secretary of State is a problem for them. In the words of Clerk Don Gray at our congressional listening session, he said, clerks are the bearers of bad news to these voters, right? Whether they intended to register to vote, voted, and then they had to send them the letter, or registered, and then they had to send them the letter to see if they were citizens. They are the ones interacting with voters on a day-to-day basis. They are the ones who are implementing elections. And so for them to not be a part of the hearings that we've had in the House, I think is an issue. And certainly they're having challenges implementing these or going through AVR. Because as Clerk Gray said, they have to take all of these registrations in good faith. And he had good suggestions. One, there used to be a paper trail. They used to see exactly how the voter intended on filling out the form, and they could follow up. They don't have that. He also suggested that when somebody is coming into the Secretary of State or another agency to change their address, why is that not forwarded on to the local election authorities so they can verify that their registration is still up to date? They have the perspective that I think we need in this conversation, and they deserve to be heard at the hearing that Representative Butler and I are calling for today. They deserve to have input, and like Representative Butler said, this is the time for suspension of AVR. Already, the registrations that are happening now with AVR are not valid for this election, and so this is the time we need an audit, we need suspension, and we need to get to the bottom of this. It's past time that we get this right.
The one thing that I would add is that, and I've said this before, this legislation passed in a bipartisan, unanimous manner in the General Assembly. It was signed by a Republican governor. Both Representative Bourne and I voted for this. We believe in AVR. We think it's the right thing to do. We don't believe in AVR when it's not carried out properly, and it's currently not being carried out properly. And we need to take a long, hard look at this to make sure it is the right system that we have in place in Illinois and correct the problems that we have so we can move forward without any of these questions in